to them. Okay, let's just start. Look at verse 9, okay, of chapter 1 of Revelation. So we're reading along, and it says in verse 9, I, John, both your brother, so I'm a fellow Christian, and companion. Whoa. The context is that map. It wasn't just John that was suffering. He says, I am your companion. I am also suffering tribulation. Tribulation? I thought the tribulation hadn't happened yet. See how this helps interpret the Bible? This is the tribulation they were going through. Greek word, thlipsis. Aren't you glad you have that Logos program that you all use, and you just right-click and thlipsis speaks of being crushed. Bonnie and I, on the way over, my wonderful wife Bonnie, is sitting right there. She's so distracting to me. Thanks for coming. She's my favorite student. But we stopped taking our trash from the apartment or the little unit we're staying in, and I had my 2 bags of trash. And do you know what they have over behind the main center? I don't know which direction it is. I guess it's over there. They have this giant thlipsis machine. It crushes boxes into little cubes. And those boxes get stuffed in there, and they're just normal, and all of a sudden it makes that big crushing noise, and it keeps going until it crushes them into that little cube, and then they band them up, and they're stacked out there. That's the word. These people were getting crushed by life around them because they didn't fit in with the Romans. They didn't fit in with their religion. They didn't fit in with the culture. What was the culture like in the first century? Well, we're going to talk about it more in chapter 2, but the culture was decadent. The culture was godless. They worshipped the gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon, and there was a god of revelry. Boy, that was fun to worship. There was a god of wine and intoxication. There were gods of sex. And if you went to the temple, it was unlimited. You could have as much sex with the temple prostitutes as you wanted. Didn't even pay for it. So they were just emissaries of the god. Can you imagine what the culture was like back then? And the Christians who wouldn't do that. Can you imagine getting out of high school and saying, hey, where are you going? Well, let's all go to the temple first. And you'd say, I can't anymore. I'm a Christian. They'd go, what's wrong with you? See, they were suffering. So John, keep going in verse 9. To the tribulation and the kingdom, that's seek ye first. Jesus already said that. See, the scriptural context, what is the kingdom? Jesus said, seek ye first the what of God? The kingdom, the rule of God. Basileia is the word. So let God rule in your life, and you're going to suffer tribulation. And the patience of Jesus Christ. I was on the island called Patmos. Okay? So what's the first thing we see from verse 9? John was at the worst time of his life. Honestly, historically. He was alone. Basically, his brother gets killed back in Acts 12. How would you like your brother hacked to death with a sword because he was a Christian? That would be traumatic. I mean, people that go through war and accidents and disasters are traumatized. We call it, PTSD, that they go through this. John had been traumatized as a young person, his brother killed, and then all of his fellow workers in the ministry had been hunted down and killed, the other apostles. Wow. He was alone. He was out of touch. How would you like someone to take your phone away from you and lock you in a dark room? You'd go crazy. That's comparable to what happened to John. He was pastoring the largest church of the ancient world in Ephesus. That's what Eusebius, the father of church history, tells us, that the church that Paul founded, that Timothy continued to pastor, that John became the pastor. By the way, who did John take care of? Jesus' mother, Mary. So what a galaxy of superstars were in that church. And John was pastoring it, and Mary was in the congregation, and he was the last big apostle, the last living apostle. And now he's alone. He's on this island. He's out of touch with the church and everybody else. He is old. So when you get old, you get weak. He is in old age with all the infirmities. Do you know what it's like to get to be my age? Half of all your physiological systems that God created that you're born with don't work anymore, and the other half hurt. Your knees hurt, and your head hurts, and your everything hurts. It's amazing. He's in an insecure situation. He's a prisoner of Rome, and Rome is against the church. And specifically, the current empire, or emperor, and that's where the historical context is great. I'll show you a picture of him, but the current emperor was Domitian. And Domitian preferred to be called my Lord and my God when you came and addressed him. Now, would you be able to say that to a person? Think about it. Would you look at a man and do a little bow for him and say, my Lord Domitian, my God Domitian? I don't think so. Not if you're a healthy Christian. That's worshiping a false god. So he's in a very insecure situation. He's unsure about the future. Now, can you relate to any of these? I bet you can relate to the unsure about the future. I'm getting to know you slowly. I'm working my way to the back. I say, what are you going to do in the future? Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm waiting. I'm not sure. The finances, get a job. Not sure if I might go to second year. I might not go to second year. I got school debt, and I'm not married yet, or I'm going to get married. I don't know how I'm going to afford marriage. We're all somewhere. We feel alone at times. We feel out of touch with our family and friends. We feel weakness in different areas. Most of you aren't old age. There's only a couple of us in the room. Well, Bonnie isn't even old yet. So it's just me. I'm the only one in old age. But we're all in insecure situations, and all of us face unsureness about the future. And that's what the book of Revelation was written for. Wow. Have you thought about that? This book deals with all those. Now, this is the context, the geographic context. This is, I showed you this before, from northern half or the southern half of Britain all the way across northern Africa into the Middle East and just surrounding the Mediterranean. And right there, the end of that arrow, that's where John was. Alone, insecure, facing all this. Secondly, and by the way, these are my observations from this book to continue helping you. These are the kind of observations you should be practicing as you do your 10 chapters. It's my life's desire until the Lord takes away my mind and eyesight and I go home to be with Him. I'm going to be doing this for a chapter of the Bible every day of my life. I've got my little journal this morning in the dark. I had my little journal open and my Bible open. I'm working through, I'm on 1 Peter 4 at the current moment this morning, and I'm looking for observations. When I was in John 1, I wrote this. John was a prisoner of the empire on Patmos. He had been hunted, he had been captured, he had been exiled, and he was now trapped. Now, Bonnie and I last year, October, I think, I don't know, we had the amazing privilege, we got to spend a whole week on Patmos, and I got to teach through the whole book of Revelation on Patmos. It was an amazing time. But John was a prisoner. He was on the island of Patmos off the coast of Turkey, 10 miles long, 6 miles wide, exiled by Domitian, who served between 81 and 96. And according to Eusebius, the father of church history, John was released in the year 96 when Domitian died. And Nero, the next emperor, became emperor of Rome. He opened the prisons. Kind of like, presidents can commute sentences and pardon people. Well, the emperor pardoned all of Domitian's people. Now look at this. When Jesus sent Revelation, he knew there were going to be centuries of godless, immoral emperors who just weren't bad politicians. They were absolutely and ruthlessly in power. They were dictators. They could just order execution of anyone. They could have their legionnaires do anything. As long as they had legionnaires, they were totally, absolutely in power. And these guys were ruthless. Now look at this. The whole book of Revelation was sent to guide believers through hard times. Now, when I think Mark said, I'll be back with eschatology. Did I hear him say that? Did Mark Strout say that? Yeah. In eschatology, he's going to talk about the either 3 or 4 different views of Revelation, of the interpretation of it. And there's the preterist you've heard about, and they say, oh, it already happened in AD 70. And then there's the historicists, and they said it's kind of like the overview of the long-term view of history. And then there's the idealist, which says that Revelation is filled with all kinds of exciting, encouraging stuff. Guess what? All of those are true. that there is historical stuff in Revelation. There is stuff that happened at AD 70 that's in Revelation. John knew that 1 million Jews were killed. And there are these idealistic great things. Revelation truly was sent by God to guide believers through hard times, but if you understand what God's doing, he is giving the church what Jesus started in Matthew 24, which is a map of the future. That's called the futurist view. And of course, that's Word of Life's view, and that's, what I'm teaching, and that's also what God presents, that it's the map to the end of the world. But look at these emperors. This is Julius Caesar. You've all heard of him. This is Augustus Caesar. Now, these are those AI-generated, that they look at all of the different carvings of statuary, and they kind of morph them into what they would look like if they weren't made of stone. And so that's where these images come from. But Augustus, the birth of Christ, Tiberius, the ministry of Christ. The early church was under Caligula and Claudius. By the way, when Claudius, look, he's wearing this big oak leaf crown there. Claudius is the one that pushed into the British Isles with the Roman legions. He expended all the might of Rome to conquer Britain all the way up to Scotland. And if you look at the dates, 37 to 54, that's exactly when Paul finished training in Antioch and started his first missionary journey. And Paul was able to spread the gospel as widely as Claudius was able to spread the empire. And we'll talk about that later. And then we have Nero. He's the bad guy we've all talked about. He actually, other than being immoral and godless and a murderer and profligate and contumacious and indomitable and every other word you can think of, he was an amazing architect. The Roman government has just started unearthing his palace. It's called the Domus Aurea in Rome. If you ever get to Rome, don't miss seeing what they found. The architecture. This guy had such an eye for textures and color and symmetry and balance. And he was a big producer of banquets. He would have in his 100-foot-high banquet hall, while people were eating, there would be slaves and they would be dropping rose petals on them that were scented with exotic fragrances. He even made the ceiling. He had slaves turning the ceiling, and it had flecks of gold, and they had lights on it so that it would look like stars twinkling during his... he was an amazing guy. Godless, yes. And then Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then Vespasian, and here's our guy. I wanted to get to him, Domitian. So what was Revelation for? It was written to guide people through centuries of godless, immoral rulers, and they're still around, okay? We still have in this world. To those weary, suffering saints, God sent, starting in verse 11, the only picture of Jesus in the Bible. Have you noticed it? Did you know there's no other picture of Jesus? There's a slight description of him in Isaiah 53. It says his visage, his face, is so marred more than any man. And Jesus said that they plucked out my beard. Do you remember all that's in the scripture? But it never tells us what he looks like until we get here. Look what it says starting in verse 11. It says in verse 10, I was in the Spirit. We already covered that. I heard this voice as of a trumpet. And John in verse 12 turned to see the voice that spoke with me. And first he sees the lampstand, and then in verse 13, he sees Jesus. And this is what Jesus looks like. He's like the Son of Man. He had a garment down to his feet. He was girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were flaming like fire. And verse 15, his feet were like fine brass refined in the furnace. That means glowing, yellow, white hot, red hot. His voice sounded like many waters. On that clip, you heard the little wave sound. If you've ever been to Niagara Falls or any giant or in some hurricane when the ocean is roaring, you hear that sound of many waters. And then it says in verse 16, his right hand is holding 7 stars. His mouth had a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. And when John saw him in verse 17, he collapsed and fell as if dead. 7 elements: his hair, his eyes, his feet, his voice, his hands, his mouth, and his face, to reveal Jesus as the risen Christ.